All right, it's time for football at 4. We'll dive into the Eagles, the NFL. They've got Thursday night a tune-up with the Ravens. But what's going on with the Ravens this week? They've been in town practicing. What are we learning about these two teams, Eagles and Ravens? They'll play Thursday night. You can listen to the game on 97.3 ESPN. John McMullen, of course, covers the Eagles, covers the NFL for 97.3 ESPN.com. As the Eagles getting ready for that matchup. What are we finding out about this team in practice this week, though? We heard Zach Ertz saying, hey, these practices have been a big help. I get 50-so reps in a practice environment. I'm not getting nearly that many reps in a preseason game. We know a lot of the conversation going back and forth about the preseason and how little it benefits the starting level players. But which players is this game actually important for? We'll get into all that and more as the Eagles get ready for Thursday night with the Ravens and John McMullen at practice with the Birds as they get ready for that matchup. A couple of days here. I know yesterday, John, you were saying it was a scorcher up there as these two teams getting ready. But I read reading that you said, I don't see the Ravens all the time, but their secondary is legit. These guys in the back end of that defense, pretty good, which would mean on Thursday night, I guess the Eagles receivers and quarterbacks are going to get an interesting look.
Yeah, I don't know. We'll see because I think the Ravens are going to handle it the same as the Eagles. So I think the fact that they're having these joint practices is going to limit the reps for their starters as well. Although I think John Harbaugh's a little bit more toward Andy Reid than, say, Doug Peterson. So I think he would be more apt to give his starters at least a little bit of a look. I still get a feeling that Carson Wentz might not even play, and if he does, he'd probably hand it off 3 times and leave the game, or maybe throw a little swing pass to Miles Sanders or Darren Sproles or something like that. But I doubt Darren Sproles will play. So, if you want to see the starters, sit down quickly and get your drink and enjoy it because it's not going to be long.
Yeah, and I guess that's kind of been the way that it's going. And Doug Peterson kind of insinuated that you wrote about it at 97.3 ESPN.com that the preseason is changing the way that they're evaluating things.
Yeah, I got into it a little bit with Ryan on Twitter. I don't understand why people don't see this. The head coach says it, and they don't believe it. I don't know why. I mean, he doesn't want to play his starters, certainly. And even from a standpoint of evaluation, I think we just got off the field right now. This is the 18th practice of the summer. You have 18 walkthroughs. On top of that, you have all the meetings. The preseason games are not as important, even with the back end of the roster, as people think they are. I'm comparing it to a college class for the people who went to college. Maybe it's 20% of your final grade. Mm-hmm. But if you stink in practice, that means more than playing well in games. And like I said, you can just use it from that standpoint. You hear the way Doug talks about the reps in practice and how he can set things up the way he wants to set up. He can look at what he wants to look at. And that's not just the starters. That's also the reserves and the guys who are going to be the back end of the roster. They're getting evaluated in this atmosphere as well.
The one thing, and we we're talking with Colin Thompson yesterday, who's been in a couple of camps, and he said, these are very valuable for guys like him who are trying to get on that roster, and this is that is one point that he made a couple of points that I thought were interesting. I still tend to say, look, we sensationalize sometimes when we say it's not important because we're really only talking about the guys we care about, the starters, the top-end guys, the back-end players. How else do they get on tape if not in those games?
Well, it's a legitimate point, and I've talked to Colin about this as well. It's a legitimate point for outside the organization. It's not legitimate inside the organization. Like I said, they're getting evaluated as far as same as the starters. And what I talked about, those 18 practices, those 18 walkthroughs, they're not just looking at Zach Ertz and Alshon Jeffrey. They're trying to figure out who their best 53 is, or at least the best 53 they can put together. Now, if you're talking about organizations, guys who are going to get cut, yeah, it's a little bit more important for them to show up at, say, another organization they might notice. But also from that standpoint, look, guys they go through the draft process. So when Joe Douglas was here, Andy Weidel, now Andrew Berry, Howie Roseman, they see a lot of players they like from their college tape and that they would like. So even from that standpoint, when you see somebody, a young player, get picked up on waivers, it's more of what that organization thought of them from their college tape and from their original scouting. And then when they bring them into the building, they kind of take the temperature on what type of player that is and whether they like him or not. So I think even from that standpoint, it's a little overrated, to be honest.
Yeah. No, and I think, both sides make points. I tend to lean more towards that the coaches are getting more evaluation from these controlled practices. Now, Colin had told us he's been a part of these, and they map out the whole day. They tell you, all right, you're going to get 6 reps, 6 reps, 2 reps, 2 reps. They basically tell you every first team, second team, third team, how many reps you're getting, what reps you're going to get, in what situation you're going to do it in.
Yeah, and as Jim Schwartz has flat out told me on numerous occasions, off season is for teaching, a training camp is for evaluation, and then regular season mode, you're obviously preparing for the next opponent on your schedule. So that's how the coaches look at it. Training camp is for evaluation of what not only players, individual players, because there's certain players that are good and you know what they are, and you see the Eagles handle them, whether it's Fletcher Cox or even lesser players they've shut down. I mentioned Lane Johnson, Dallas Goedert, Nigel Bradham, players like that their goal is week one. All the proven players. But also, as I said, the back end of the roster. They're also evaluating those guys. And it's more important to show up in practice than it is in a game. I'm not saying it's not. There's no value at all. As I said, if Deshaun Hall doesn't make this team, we can officially, at that point, put the toe tag on preseason games, because you can't play better than Deshaun Hall has played in the preseason.
Right. Well, and I guess the retort to that would be he's doing it against guys who are also in the same situation that he's in.
Well, that's part of it too. You have to scale in the fact that you have to realize who they're playing against, and that's part of it as well. So when people look at Deshaun Hall and see all the explosion and his ability and all the playmaking, and they're a little disappointed with Josh Sweat, for instance, well, Josh Sweat was playing against better players. So it's more difficult to make a big play against a Taylor Lewan than it is against a third-string tackle. So that plays into it as well, and I think sometimes people don't realize, like what I said about the Eagles against the Ravens. Well, a couple things about these two practices, and I mentioned about how good the starting secondary of the Ravens are. So at times, Carson Wentz didn't look as effective as he has at other parts of training camp, because guess what? Earl Thomas isn't out there. Humphrey isn't out there. And he was out there. Those players were out there the last 2 days. Conversely, defensively, the Ravens have a bunch of quarterbacks that can't hit the broadside of a barn. So you have to take that into effect. At one point in practice today, Mike, you had 3 interceptions in 4 plays for the Eagles defense. So that, if people were here, that would get a lot of people excited. But you realize Trace McSorley and Joe Callahan are throwing the ball, South Jersey's own. Hey, that's not top-tier level quarterbacks in this league. And even Lamar Jackson, accuracy is not his strength.
Yeah, John McMullen at JF McMullen. In these practices, how much of that do you guys get to see? Because Carson Wentz is a guy that we haven't got to see at all. Is he getting a lot of reps in these particular practices? I know yesterday Mike Rowe was asked about him. How about Wentz's performance? What's he doing? Because nobody gets to see him right now.
Yeah, he's getting a ton of reps, and that's the point. That's why I don't think he's going to play ultimately. That and the fact that Lane Johnson's not going to play. I don't think they're going to play Jason Peters. Certainly Brandon Brooks isn't going to play. And at that point, you're probably not even going to play Jason Kelsey. And if you're not going to play four of those, you're not going to play Isaac Seumalo. So do you really want your $108 million quarterback behind a second-team offensive line?
Yeah.
Doug hasn't said it yet, but that's the feeling I get, that he's not going to play at all. And that's why they have ramped up his work in practice. And there are times he gets 50 reps in practice, like Zach Ertz said. When Zach Ertz talked about 50 reps, well, guess what? Carson Wentz is on the field for all 50 of them.
Yeah, and I know Wentz, he's tough because seeing the two guys going down. I know that, I don't know, you might know more than I would say I know that he probably wants to get a couple of snaps out there, but probably realize, because he hasn't played in a live game in so long, he probably just wants to kind of get something going. But how close are these scrimmages, these practices, to a preseason game?
Well, and Doug talked about that again today as well, and he scripts it to be as close to a preseason game as you can get. And he says it's just as valuable, in a lot of ways more valuable, because he can look at actually what he wants to look at. He doesn't have to wait for that situation to evolve in a game, and it may never evolve. So if you want to work on red zone stuff, well, if you got, say, Carson Wentz earmarked for 3 series and you don't make it in the red zone, guess what? You can't work on red zone stuff. But you can script that in practice. You can script being backed up on the goal line. You can script 2-minute work, hurry-up work, 4-minute offense. The Eagles do all of this in practice, and that's why he says, and he said consistently on more than one occasion this summer, he finds practice at this point more valuable than preseason games. And that's what I kind of told Colin as well. Look, I think, and I can't speak from, but preseason used to be a lot more important under the old CBA. And even when people were feeling out the current CBA, they regarded it as more important. But that worm has turned. In the last 3 or 4 years, they don't value it as much. So I think a lot of old school guys are looking at the old system, and there I agree with him. It was important. In this system, it's not important.
Yeah.
And I wish it were.
Yeah, I think we all do. I mean, like, there's I heard Harry Mays talking about this on Mays and Aton. It's like, you used to get kind of excited, like, okay, the first preseason game, you got to see them. Then you knew that second one, you got them for, and then the third one, it was like, we are there. We're getting there. And now it's almost regressing. You're getting less and less and less. It seems like, as opposed to you were getting a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more. But my question really goes to just helping or hurting the product. Do you think it has an effect?
Oh, it's definitely hurting the product. There's no question. This is not the same product. But it's not just the preparation. It's not just the scaling back of preseason. That's the scaling back of practices in total, which has, I talk about it a lot. I've talked with you a lot about it, the fact that you sort of do a cost-benefit analysis. And under the old system, coaches valued preparation. They did everything to prepare for the regular season as much as they could. Under the new system, they've kind of figured out you can't prepare like you want to anyway, so the main goal has shifted to be as healthy as possible with your key players for week 1. And especially early in the season, you talk about sloppy football, and I guarantee you Eagles fans are going to be upset at some point early in the season because they're going to see some sloppy football. But what they're not going to realize is that happens everywhere. It's not just Philadelphia. That's the new NFL.
Yeah.
And it gets better the more you play and the more guys get ready. But even from that standpoint, then you start talking about, people talk about baseball, same thing. Basketball, three-point shot. Is the game as aesthetic as it once was? No, it's not. I don't think anybody would argue that has seen football from, say, the 80s, where, let's be honest, there weren't as many rules from a safety standpoint. The game was more entertaining from a pure entertainment value.
Right, because, this can't be good for the guys like J.J. Arcega-Whiteside, for Miles Sanders, rookies who are trying to find their way into some sort of role. And, they don't really have any game action. I guess that's one area where now you say, well, no, they're getting these scrimmages, and that's close enough that they're the play. But still, being in that stadium and having a crowd and all that stuff, when you're that level of player.
Even that, I would say, Mike, and guys like Miles and JJ, they're in that category of key contributors. So they're already there. The Eagles project them. We're not just talking about the starters. We're talking about guys they expect to be contributors. And they're in that category. Miles Sanders got a ton of work with the first team today against the number one defense in the NFL from last year.
Okay.
So that's very valuable from his standpoint. And, hey, he looks more explosive than Jordan Howard. I think it comes down to whether the Eagles think he can pass protect and protect Carson Wentz and that investment. And I think if he can, you're going to see a lot of Miles Sanders. And they're working on that every single day in practice. So, and then from the second standpoint of what you're saying, and I've heard this argument, and it doesn't make sense to me because Miles Sanders played at Penn State. 100,000 people. J.J. Arcega-Whiteside played at Stanford, 70,000 people. And they go to Notre Dame and they go to USC and they play in those environments. They're used to the big lights and the big stage. And being in front of 20,000 people in Jacksonville is not important. Now, you can say it's important for somebody from a lower level school, but not guys like that. Mm. They played on bigger stages than they're going to play on Sundays in the NFL.
We also know Thursday night somebody has to play. Who are guys that are going to play that we think right now that can benefit from Thursday?
Well, I think everybody on the back end of that roster. I mean, you're going to see a lot of Cody Kessler. You're going to see a lot. He's through concussion protocol, so he's going to be available. You're going to see a lot of Clayton Thorson. You're going to see a lot of those back end receivers, the Greg Wards, the Mark and Michelle's. I think it's important for somebody like Matt Collins, who's coming back from the injury. It's important for Corey Clement, who's coming back from an injury, finally getting back in the mix. Players of that ilk, I think it's helpful to get out there and get in a live environment, live reps. And as I said, it's not invaluable. It's just less valuable than it's ever been.
No, and you mentioned Matt Collins. Now, a lot of people don't know what to think about him. Is he a shoo-in? Does he need to do something, whether it be in a game, in practice? I mean, is there some names that have made the team or we thought were going to make the team 2 or 3 weeks ago that maybe we're now changing our opinion of?
Well, I think the most interesting, I already mentioned, that's Deshaun Hall, because he was not projected by most people to make this team when things started. Also, Joe Osman got hurt, who was projected to make the team by most, so that helps. I think a lot of people look at him and say he certainly performed better than Josh Sweat, but I think Josh Sweat is still ahead of him from a coaching perspective. From some of the things I explained, it's not just about the games. So he's the most interesting to me because I'm using him as a litmus test. And I said he literally cannot do anything else. He has dominated in the opportunities he has gotten in the preseason. So if he doesn't make the final 53, I don't know what to say. Yeah. Matt Collins, look, he has been bad. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. He dropped another pass today. He dropped a pass on Sunday. He hurt his hip, and he's going to make this team. And Doug mentioned him today, sort of out of the blue, and that's a red flag from a perspective of the Eagles consider him a part of this team. He's a good special teams player. Maybe they value that to that degree. To be honest, I don't understand. And it kind of what I talk about a lot as well, defaulting to draft picks. They don't want to admit that mistake, to be honest.
Yeah, which is tough for some of the talented guys behind him because it seems like you keep mentioning Mark and Michelle, and I mean I'm wondering like where he is at all with the opportunity to make this team. Greg Ward, another guy they already let go of, Braxton Miller. It just seems that Hollins is getting it based on his draft status.
Yeah, he is. I
Fair
mean,
to
there's
say?
no other explanation, because I would say it from a receiving standpoint. Greg Ward has outplayed him. Marcus Michelle has outplayed him. Charles Johnson has outplayed him. You can argue Carlton Agudosi has outplayed him, although he's kind of had a couple rough days of practice. I think he's falling back a bit and is more likely a practice squad candidate. But just as a receiver, all of those guys have performed better. But Mack is a draft choice. He's coming off an injury, so that's part of it as well. He is a good special teams player. And in their defense, if you're going to be the fifth receiver on the team, well, you're not going to play much as a receiver. So it's probably more important that you help on special teams. And Mack is a better special teams player than all of those names. So I think that's his trump card.
Also, Andre Dillard on the offensive line, the first-round pick, obviously going to get a lot of snaps. You've seen a lot of him. Do we look at him as a guy who we think, yep, they got something with him?
Oh, yeah, they do. I've covered this league for over 20 years. I don't think I've ever seen a more natural pass protector. I mean, he's out there stoning people, and he did it again today in one-on-ones, and the Ravens have good pass rushes. Pernell McPhee, Matt Judon, they have good players. He is an amazing pass protector. Now, he wasn't asked to run block, and Jeff Stoutland has talked about it a lot. He's better than expected already because he's so athletic, and he's picking it up as far as technique and taking the right angles. And Jeff Stoutland talks about surface blocks all the time. He is really good. And remember, he's a luxury. He's not even going to play because Jason Peters is the left tackle. Lane Johnson is the right tackle, and it doesn't get much better than that. So the Eagles have not only the best offensive line in football, they have the deepest offensive line in football, and it's pretty impressive.
Well, obviously, he's a guy to keep an eye on Thursday night because, you like to see the young guys, the first-round picks. And one other area, I should say. Mosher and I were talking about this in the first area of the show. Who's the odd man out on playing time in the Darby, Sidney Jones, Russell Douglas, Avonte Maddox, Orlando Scandrix? I guess if you want to throw Mills mix.
Well, the three guys who are going to play, because Jalen Mills is probably going to start the season on the PUP list. Doug didn't admit that today, but there's no indication he's going to be back at practice anytime soon. So the three guys that are going to play are Ronald Darby, if he's cleared, if he's healthy, Avonte Maddox, and Sidney Jones. And Avonte's going to be the slot corner. And it's interesting you bring this up because today was the first day, and Jim Schwartz against the Ravens played Ronald Darby at left corner, Sidney Jones at right corner. Typically, it's the other way around. Those other two, Rasul could potentially push Sidney Jones if Sidney struggles, but I don't think that's going to happen. And Orlando Scandrix, he's not in that conversation with those top four corners. I mean, those are the guys that are going to play. And it's just a matter of where they're going to put Darby. They consider Ronald Darby their best corner. Generally, the best corner plays left corner because most quarterbacks are right-handed. Typically, he's played right corner here. But if you go all the way back to his first season when he was here, remember he broke his ankle very early in the season. He was at left corner. And then they were forced to put Jalen Mills over there. And when he eventually came back, they just stuck him. They kept him at right corner. I could see them moving him to left corner. So it's more of the positioning, but it's going to be Darby. It's going to be Jones. It's going to be Maddox.
All right, Thursday night, Eagles and Ravens right here on 97.3 ESPN. We might not learn a whole heck of a lot, but we will have a football game to see and hear, and John McMullen covering it all, getting us ready for the opener, which we now think we will see Case Keenum, it looks like.
Yeah, and he should. I mean, he's their best quarterback. And obviously, Eagles fans remember the last time he was here. It didn't work out for him. They're hoping the same thing happens in week one. I think it's a good opponent to have. That's not a very good football team. So when I talked about sloppy play early in the season, I think the Eagles can afford to be sloppy against that team and probably still beat them. So it's a nice opponent to have week one.
All right, John McMullen, at JF McMullen. More on the Eagles tomorrow as they get ready for the Ravens, and we got a lot of NFL news we will cover as well as after Hard Knocks tonight. We'll see if Antonio Brown has found a helmet yet.
Yeah, how about that? He always comes into camp right to get on Hard Knocks. Pretty entertaining.
He's the man.
There's a deadline to be on there each week, and he comes in for that day and then leaves again.
All right, pal. We'll talk tomorrow.
All right, thanks.
Football at 4. Use the hashtag football at 4 on Twitter. Hashtag football at 4.